You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Jeffrey Frank. He's a terrific, brilliant author. We are going to discuss today his book, The Trials of Harry S. Truman, which I just finished a few months ago. It's superb. But Mr. Frank was also a senior editor at The New Yorker and the deputy editor of the Washington Post Outlook section. He is the author of another terrific book, which he said he will come back on the podcast to discuss, and that's Ike and Dick, Portrait of a Strange Political Marriage, which reminded me a lot in its own ways of Jules Witcover's book called Strange Bedfellows, which was about Nixon and Agnew, perhaps the strangest bedfellows of all. Mr. Frank, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Mr. Vane. Nice to meet you. Nice to be here.
So let's get started very quickly on who Harry Truman was. You focus on his administration. I would say more on foreign policy than domestic policy. But the beginning of your book is kind of a short biography of how Truman got to the Senate and then eventually the vice presidency in 1944. So in your mind, who is Harry Truman and how did he sort of, I'm not going to say accidentally ascend to a high place in politics in Washington, D.C., but it doesn't appear to be part of some grand plan.
No, actually, what's interesting, he really didn't begin his political career or in Washington. He was 50 years old. He'd run for some local offices. He was the county judge in Jackson County, which by the way had nothing to do with the law. It was just basically a county administrator. But then it sort of happened. He was close to Boss Pendergast, who was running the Democratic machine there, which is a slightly corrupt machine. But Truman himself was pretty clean. And then Pendergast said, "Would you like to run for Congress?" And Truman said, "Yeah, I'd love to." And then Pendergast said, "Well, you can't. But here you could run for the Senate," which was a really long shot. And that was 1950. I'm sorry, 1934, and he did. He won with a little help from some friends.
Is that what we call it these days?
Yeah.
But he was someone who was very proud of his sort of everyman roots. And how did that translate into his public service career?
Well, that was real. I think he was very proud of having served in World War I. He was actually faced combat. That was when he was in France with the Allied forces. You know, Franklin Roosevelt was in Washington. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. I mean, so Truman from that period, Truman was he was proud of that, and he was proud of his own background. He'd been a farmer. Someone who was not a big fan of Truman. The editor of the Kansas City Star said when he became president, "Here's a man who spent 10 years looking at the rear end of a horse," because he was plowing the fields outside Grandview. But he was a tough guy, and that's what that prepared him. Then when he was in the Senate, he sort of had a great old time for his first term, but after he won his second term in 1940, he began to settle down. He became a much more serious legislator, and he had the idea of chairing a committee to look at waste and fraud in the defense industry. This is before the war started, and he was successful enough that he was on the cover of Time magazine, and he was a tough guy who knew what he wanted, and he studied hard. And I think that was also the real Truman. He was also a man who was limited by his background in some way. He was the son of grandson of the Confederacy, and that stayed with him.
He was born, I think, was it 1884, May 8th, 1884?
Yeah.
And so how much did it matter in your mind to Missouri voters that he had looked at the back end of a horse or a mule? Was it a time still when that sort of rural background, much closer to the Thomas Jefferson view of what the United States should be, still had some cachet?
I think it did have cachet in a sense, but that was before he was in the infantry and was saw combat in France, but of course it did count. I mean, he was one of them, and Jackson County was a deep part of him, a real part of him, and so I think it did count with voters in Jackson, and also he knew everyone in the county, so that's how that sort of got him his start in sort of local office. But between the Trumans and the Wallace, his family, Bess Wallace, his wife's family, they knew basically everybody. That's an exaggeration, but he was very much plugged into his local part of the world.
Is there any? You mentioned his service in World War I. Is there any record, and we'll get to this later, that he ever was in the presence or met Douglas MacArthur while they were both over in France?
Never. I think he was not even General Pershing, but he wasn't. I mean, and Eisenhower, by the way, at that time was somewhere training soldiers out in Texas. I mean, he was kind of a grunt, but he became more than that. And I think what he discovered that he could win the respect of men. He could command men. And this was, by the way, a Missouri Baptist, and he was commanding, Irish Catholics from Kansas City, and he pulled it off, and that sort of gave him a lot of confidence, and that was very important to him too.
And he was a slight man, as opposed to like Patton, who was bigger, and some of the other more kind of commanding presence. Truman would be a point guard in today's society.
Yeah, but that's true enough. But Truman was a little bit sensitive about that. But after he met Stalin and Churchill, they were all short guys. I think Stalin was the shortest, but I think they're all about 5'5" or 5'6", and Truman was very much aware of that, and say he was and he was sensitive about his height and his slightness. But
how did his time in the Senate, to the extent you can be? But how did his time in the Senate? He was elected in 1934. He joins Franklin Roosevelt's ticket for the fourth term in 1944. They displace Henry Wallace. And I'm going to ask you about him in terms of Truman's reception from the more progressive or liberal wing of the party. But how did his being in the Senate train him to be president? Because he was vice president for only 3 months, 2 months, 3 months.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not sure that it did. It's a job that you really can't train for. And but he was able to he was a legislator, and he got along with his fellow senators, and I think he didn't know much about say foreign affairs, but he learned. As I said earlier, he was a good student. He really immersed himself in the briefing books, in the papers, and so on. After Roosevelt died, and he was it's when he first met Averell Harriman, who rushed back from Moscow. Averell Harriman was the American ambassador to the Soviet Union. As Harriman started to talk about, did you read the stuff I sent you? Are you aware that Stalin is not keeping his word about Poland? And Truman said, yeah, I read everything. And I think Truman really had read everything. I'm not sure he completely understood it, but he had read it. So he was a good student. In that sense, he became more and more ready to be president. And by the way, I don't think by that time he had not been told about this thing we had developed called an atomic bomb. That came just about then. And
the device, wasn't it? That's what it was called, the device.
Yeah.
Did So let's talk a little bit, please. You mentioned it in your book, and it's been mentioned obviously in other treatments of Truman's life. So Roosevelt's elected to a fourth term in November of 44. He defeats Thomas Dewey. He's inaugurated in January. Isn't that right? The lame duck amendment had already taken place.
Yeah.
And so he's inaugurated in January of 45. He dies April 12th of 45.
Right.
So Truman is basically for 3 months vice president. And everything I've ever read about Truman, including your treatment, it mentions just how out of the loop and uninformed Truman was as vice president, that it was like almost purposeful by Franklin Roosevelt to keep him away or just not consider him. Is that overstating it? Do biographers get that wrong? Or is it like, no, compared to what we do these days, the Vice President Truman was alarmingly uninformed and uninvolved.
No, that's about right. After Roosevelt and Truman were nominated for the Democratic ticket, they had lunch. They had one lunch. They had lunch together in August of 1944 on the White House lawn, and that was it. That was the only time that I can find where they actually had a time together. He saw Roosevelt. There were some meetings with some of the cabinet people and other and legislators, but he never. That was his one time alone with Roosevelt. He was completely uninformed. He complained to people that later on that he wasn't. He was told nothing, and that's absolutely true. He was not ready for this job, and so little so that actually later on he would actually begin to imagine. He would actually recall having long talks with Roosevelt about history and about, which of course never happened. Truman, and we all do this sometimes. We all make up things that we wish had happened, and Truman did that. Truman did that too. No, there was no connection. There was no preparation at all for the presidency. There was nothing. And in fact, just before. Right after the inauguration, Roosevelt was off to Yalta to meet with Stalin and Churchill, and before that he had told Truman, "Well, if you must reach me, send it by diplomatic pouch, but basically don't bother me." Truman basically asked for some patronage. He wanted Robert Hannigan, who had helped him a lot win votes for his Senate campaign. He wanted him to be Postmaster General. At that point, a friend of Roosevelt's was Postmaster General Roosevelt. So that's an interesting idea. I'll consider that. And that was basically their last interaction by message, and that was it. And then after Roosevelt came back from Yalta, he gave a speech to Congress. He got on the train, went down to Warm Springs, Georgia, and that's where he stayed until the day he died, which was April 12th.
So tell us a little bit about how, and you actually have a picture. You have a picture of Truman taking the oath of office in your book. I had never seen that picture before. Yeah. So I was fascinated by it, mostly by the looks on his wife's face, Beth, and his daughter's face, Margaret. Beth looks absolutely horrified that her husband's going to be president of the United States. And Truman, of course, looks very, very dignified and very statesmanlike. But how did Truman get the word about FDR's death, and how did he react?
By the way, those pictures they're extraordinary. I mean, you think at first, they're grief-stricken. No, they were horror-stricken. I mean, they were having a pretty good old time while Truman was vice president. They would go out to parties. Margaret became this sort of protege of Pearl Mesta, this Washington hostess, and so they were, and so no, he was. They were. So Truman had to. So then Truman suddenly had to go. He had to speak before the nation. And he sounded horrible. He sounded almost like someone reading someone who was completely shell shocked. And that's how he acted. He told people there was much quoted statement to reporters, "Boys, if you pray for anybody, pray for me." I felt like the moon and the stars. This was all said again by many people. Many accounts have him meeting with Eleanor Roosevelt right after the word came to him, and basically saying, "What can I do for you?" He had been planning to have a poker game that night with one of his friends, and then the word came, "You better get to the White House quick." And he got to the White House, and they found out quick that what had gone on, and then from then on his life changed. he was been living in an apartment on Upper Connecticut Avenue in Washington, in the sort of just south of Chevy Chase Circle, and he sent he had his wife and daughter come down for the swearing in, and that was it. From now on, he was president. Secret Service, all of it. He I think he lived in his apartment for a few more days, but then he moved to Blair House across the Lafayette Park while Mrs. Roosevelt stayed in the White House, and then Truman moved to the White House. His life changed just like that.
You mentioned, I can't imagine. I mean, you go through all the presidents and you look at Lyndon Johnson's face, on Air Force One after November 22nd, 63. But you mentioned something a few minutes ago, and I want to make sure, since we're all history buffs here on the Leaders and Legends podcast, Truman was a great lover of history and a voracious reader. But in your book, and I'm sure that helped him kind of get through the transition period, right? And try to help him understand the issues and make the right decision. But he misapplied it sometimes, or his interpretation seemed a bit off. You detail that in the book. How do you think that Truman's love of history and perhaps sometimes sketchy interpretation of it affected his time as president and his leadership?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, he had his own very peculiar reading of history, but I'm really not sure. I mean, he tended to, we all sort of reassess presidents. I mean, I think Truman thought very highly of Andrew Johnson, who was probably one of our worst presidents, and so on. I think he was. I think Lincoln's presidency influenced him, and I think he just tried to be judicious. He was a great reader of history. One of the first books he read almost as a child, his mother, who was a big reader herself, gave him this multi-volume set called Great Men and Famous Women, and he read all of it. He read, and he became sort of fascinated by the king of Sweden and Robert E. Lee had all these sort of heroes. So I think he became immersed in our history, the America's history. But I don't think it very much affected his presidency. I think as I say, he learned. He was self-taught, and he kept learning. And I don't think he said, I don't think he ever said, what would Roosevelt do? What would Lincoln do? That wasn't his way.
And he never went to college, or just went for a little while?
He went to night school for a couple of years. Basically, he was maybe even he might have become a lawyer, but he didn't stay. He had to go work on the farm. So that never happened. So he's the only modern president who never graduated from college. I mean, obviously, in earlier days, Abe Lincoln never went to college. Washington never went to college. So
he's in good company
in the modern era. Yeah, it's true.
But he didn't. I mean, the term accidental president's always applied somewhat harshly towards vice presidents who come and who ascend to the Oval Office. His accidency, I think, is that. I don't know if that's John Tyler, but it's one of them. I can't remember which one. But he didn't jack around, in a sense that when he became president and didn't like, oh, I shouldn't be here. I mean, he may have lamented his fate, but it wasn't like, from what I read, that he acted differently because he didn't get there on his own.
Yeah, I mean, I think, but yeah, I mean, at first he was completely shell shocked. He went to the Hill where he was comfortable, and by one account he said, I'm not ready for this. This is too big for me. But that was over pretty quickly. He also realized he had to do certain things. He had to go to Berlin. Potsdam was a suburb of Berlin, and he was basically duty bound to meet Churchill. Prime Minister Churchill of England and Joseph Stalin, the leader of Russia, and he didn't particularly want to go, but he knew he had to go, and so that was so he jumped into it. He knew who else was going to do this, and he also realized that the United States was it. We were the world's only power at that point. We were the superpower in every way. We were wealthier than any other country. We were more powerful any other country, and he was the president. So therefore, that alone, that gave him the authority in some way that even if he didn't have it, he had it as being president. And I think he quickly realized that being president of the United States was a big deal, even if he himself wasn't a big deal. And he came around on that.
Well, just to put this in greater context too, before we move on, is in the sense that, when Tyler took over for Harrison, and what was it, like 30 days or 90 days? And a lot of these folks, John F. Kennedy was president for roughly 1,000 days, but there were, I'm sure, part of the mentality of the shock of Roosevelt's death was that he had been president for more than 12 years.
Yeah.
And so you simply couldn't imagine a United States without Franklin Roosevelt as president. Yeah. So it's a completely different atmosphere or environment. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. I was so struck by that. None of us can imagine having a president for 12 years. That would be for the time if we were 8 years old till the time we were 20. It would have been the only thing we would have known. People were so again, I don't want to use that word, but people were so stunned by Roosevelt's death. There were stories of people, getting off at the wrong floor and when they went to work. People were it was really, really something. And hard to get used to it, and even Stalin was kind of deeply moved by it. They got along pretty well, if you could believe that Stalin got along and actually liked anybody. But apparently he did. Here were two kind of big guys who had been in power. Stalin had been in since 1929, but Roosevelt had been in since 1932. They've been around a long time, and they kind of understood each other. And it's unimaginable that we can have anything like that today. Obviously, no president could be president for 3 terms anymore. For more than 2 terms now. So.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is author and historian Jeffrey Frank. We're discussing his wonderful book that's gotten just terrific reviews all over the place. And the book is called The Trials of Harry S. Truman, The Extraordinary Presidency of an Ordinary Man, 1945 to 1953. You mentioned it just a few minutes ago. Shortly thereafter he becomes president, just 2 or 3 months later, he has to go to Potsdam, Germany for the latest meeting of the so-called Big Three. Yeah. And it's interesting dynamics because Yalta, I think, is in February of 45. This is in July of 45. And what was Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin eventually became Truman, Clement Attlee, Stalin at Potsdam. But what were Harry Truman's thoughts about this hugely important meeting and his approach to it and what he wanted to get out of it?
Yeah. By the way, Roosevelt. There was actually. Yeah. Churchill knew that he had an election coming up. The conference in Potsdam began, I think, on the 15th of July, and Churchill knew there was an election in the UK on the 25th. He hoped he would win, thought he might win, but he didn't win, and that was the end. And then he left and never came back again. When Truman showed up, in the back of his mind was this. He knew there was going to be the first test of an atomic bomb, the Trinity test in New Mexico, and no one knew whether this thing was going to work or not. They hoped it would work. There were every reason to think it would work, but there was no idea. So Truman basically he arrives in Potsdam on the 16th of July. He takes he goes on a tour of Berlin in the morning. He's driven around with his Secretary of State James F. Burns and a military attaché, and they go look at all the rubble of Berlin. They drive past Hitler's chancery, and this is nothing but. And then he gets back to his villa in Babelsberg. It's actually Babelsberg, this very fancy suburb of Potsdam, and then he gets the word that this atomic test had been a huge success. It had been, there were actually reports that a blind woman could see the light. It was that kind of story that came in, but Truman realized this thing really was going to exist. This thing was going to change the course of the war. And when Churchill heard about it, they walked around like someone said, like 2 boys with apples sick in their pockets. They were so happy, and they sort of kept it down. That was a huge thing when Truman knew that he had this bomb in his pocket, so to speak, and he actually used that phrase. Then he became a far more confident person than he had been before. And Churchill knew he had to decide when he was going to tell Stalin, and he waited till later the conference. Of course, Stalin probably already knew about it. That's every reason, but Truman did not know that Stalin knew about it,
Well, there's the famous story, and I'd like you to tell a little bit because you mentioned it in the book, and I think it's one of your best anecdotes. Probably not the best term, but one of the best parts of the book is that Truman had, as a senator, tried to figure out where all this money was going to for this project. And Henry Stimson, who was Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of War, kind of a famous Republican from the East Coast, as seemingly all of Roosevelt's cabinet members were from the East Coast. Something else you bring out in your book, which I think is fascinating. Anyway,
the westward shift happened then. Yeah, it's true.
Yes, that's right. And so Stimson has a conversation with Truman that basically says, you got to trust us on this one. Talk a little bit about that. And what was Truman's reaction when Stimson finally, after Truman became president, said, I must come see you and talk to you about something?
Well, Truman, as I mentioned earlier, that Truman was chairing this what became the Truman Committee, looking into sort of expenses of the Defense Department. And he noticed that there was, or one of his investigators noticed, there was an enormous amount of money being spent in this place called Pasco, Washington. What was that for? He didn't know. So he went to see Stimson and said, what's this all about? And Stimson said, well, I can't tell you, you must trust me. And then Truman said, okay. And then actually Truman was kind of annoyed. He felt, well, I'm a senator, I have every right to know. He went back to Stimson, and Stimson basically said, really no. In his diary, he basically said this Truman's a sort of mean-spirited guy. He was very annoyed. And he told Truman, basically, Roosevelt's going to be on your case if you don't shut up on this. And Truman did back off then. But when he became president and Stimson went to see him, there were no hard feelings. It was all understood that this was the conflict or the tension between a legislator and a cabinet member, and it all went away. Truman got to quite like Stimson. And
interestingly enough, perhaps maybe ironically, the bomb was detonated on July 16th, 1945. I spent 2.5 years in the Army at White Sands Missile Range. And so when I was stationed there, yes, sir, I got to visit Trinity site multiple times. And it's kind of like obviously in the middle of nowhere, but it's just fascinating to be there. And you can see the fused glass, the sand. It's called trinitite.
Yeah.
That got so hot because of the blast that it fused the sand into glass. And, for someone like me who loves history, it was a terrific place to be. But the possession of the bomb, you mentioned it gave Truman more confidence.
Yeah.
Did it also, in a sense, give him the opportunity to play peacemaker in the sense that I've got the biggest, firecracker in the world. So before we unleash all this, let's give Japan one last chance to surrender, which I think is it called the Potsdam Declaration, where they said, surrender or face utter ruin or something like that?
Yeah. That was never a serious. Yeah, they sure. Yeah, you better give up now, or we're going to rain destruction on you, such as you have never seen. But there was no way that Japan was going to surrender. And Truman knew it. Everyone knew it. And so that the Potsdam Declaration, I think, went out on July 25th, and basically the same day or the next day, Truman gave the order to drop the bomb. One of the things that happened, by the way, before this happened, there were, the first target was actually Kyoto. Kyoto was number one on the target list, and that was the idea being that this would really demoralize the Japanese. Kyoto had been the home of the Japanese emperor for 1,000 years. It was a beautiful city of shrines and temples. If you've been there, you would see this. There's not one military reason to bomb Kyoto, and Stimson, who had seen Kyoto, went to Truman and said, they will never forgive us. And so people say that Truman's big decision was dropping the atomic bomb. His big decision was not to drop the atomic bomb on Kyoto. The decision was kind of made before he became president, and there was no. And
doesn't Truman deserve, not only in this instance but throughout your book, throughout his time, high praise for listening? Just one of the things that came through when reading your book is that he genuinely gave people a chance to say their piece and listen to them, whether it was Stimson or Marshall or Atchison or Harriman or whomever. It was like, I want to know what you're thinking, and because I want to actually honestly put it in the cauldron and stir it up and see what we're going to come up with.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And he didn't want to take credit for things that other people deserve credit for. He was very generous with passing around credit to others. He also really, and of course, he was really lucky with his cabinet officers later on. I mean, particularly George Marshall, who he said he's one of the great ones of our time. So he had actually I used the word almost a man crush on Marshall, and it was
He did.
And it was so real that Marshall told one of his biographers, Forrest Pogue, that I could get him to do anything. And he said
that's right. I remember reading that in the Forrest Pogue books. Yeah. So to finish up on the A-bomb decision, there has been, at the time, there were, my senior seminar in undergraduate school was about the atomic bomb and the decision and the building of it, which of course fit into my military service like a glove. But there were a lot of folks, including Chief of Staff and 5-star Admiral William Leahy, who said the thing's never going to work. And there were a lot of people who said, look, we don't have any sympathy for the Japanese. I mean, contemporaneously, like, you Pearl Harbor, this is what you, along with all the fire bombings they did of Tokyo and other cities, like, you're getting what you deserved. But post World War II and certainly Vietnam era scholarship has somewhat, or tried to make the case, whether it's Barton Bernstein or Gar Alperowitz, that the Japanese were going to surrender. We didn't need to use the bomb. Truman made the wrong decision. What, as a historian and someone who lived through this Vietnam era, this scholarship, what's your take on that? Did Truman make the right decision?
He made. I think he made the only decision he could make. The idea we were still actually we were still fighting this. The Japanese were a hated enemy. They had the Americans who had died at Okinawa already was a great number. Truman was told that if we were to have a land invasion of Japan, it would cost 500,000 dead. That was not a good estimate. But there was no way that Truman could not do it, and there was no way that a president in wartime would not do whatever he could do to end this war as quickly as possible. There's no evidence that the Japanese were ready to surrender. They weren't ready to surrender after Hiroshima. It took the Nagasaki bomb to finally bring them to the table. And the idea that they could have been scared into surrendering by sort of a demonstration, that in the first place, the Japanese would have probably taken American POWs and put them into the target area, which would have sort of dissuaded us. I have a footnote. I kind of wish I'd put this in the text. I have a footnote in the book that Admiral Strauss, who later became the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, had this thought that we could have dropped the first bomb this is a demonstration, on the Nikko forest, where these huge cedar trees grew, and then we would evacuate everybody, and drop the bomb. When everyone came back, they would see these huge trees sort of scattered like windrows, and you would see the power of the bomb. That never went anywhere. It probably wouldn't have worked, but anyway, that sort of thing was out there. But the idea that the Japanese would have surrendered, there would have been a lot more fighting going on. And people, by the way, the number of the atomic bomb killed many fewer people than the firebombing of Tokyo did, as you suggested earlier.
So what it last?
I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead, please.
No. It was Truman. Truman never regretted it, and I'm not even sure. I don't think he felt guilt about it, but he wanted to stop it. That was after the second bomb. He said, "I don't want to kill any more kids." And yet there was a third bomb ready to go, and they might well, if the Japanese hadn't surrendered, we'll never know. But it was ready to go, and it would have been dropped on Tokyo had the Japanese not surrendered.
My great uncle, who drove a Higgins boat in 8 major landings in the Pacific, including Okinawa, I asked him, as I matured and grew up, asked him what he thought about the news, like when he got it. And he was very simple. And he wouldn't have been one of the Marines or soldiers to hit the island. He was in the Navy, obviously. And I said, "What did you think when you got the news?" And he looked at me right in the face. And I remember it like it was yesterday. And he goes, I thought I was going to live.
Yeah, I mean, there's a fairly famous book by Paul Fussell, which the title is "Thank God for the Atom Bomb," and he was exactly people who were on those ships who were in the Pacific. They were so relieved, and the idea that a president would have put them into harm's way when he didn't have to is preposterous, I think.
Last question on this topic. A lot of arguments are made to go back to Potsdam a little bit, that Truman dropped the bomb to kind of show Stalin and the Soviet Union who's boss. What do you think of this theory?
I think that I mean, it might have had some of. It might have. I don't think it had anything to do with dropping the bomb. I'm sure that it might have had some benefit. Perhaps James Burns thought that that would be a collateral benefit of dropping the bomb, but that wasn't why we dropped the bomb. We dropped the bomb to end the war against Japan. And
you are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today is journalist, author, and historian Jeffrey Frank. We are discussing his book, The Trials of Harry S. Truman. I'll put a link on the podcast so that you can pick it up. It is a terrific, terrific effort. As I was telling Mr. Frank before the podcast, I have purchased 5 copies for my Democrat friends so that they can read about Harry Truman. Truman said, and it's detailed in your book, that the hardest decision he had to make, or the most difficult decision he had to make, was intervening in Korea. Take us through, please, Truman's mindset and his process as he committed American troops to the defense of South Korea.
When that happened, there had been a sort of rethinking of America's goals. There was a national security paper called shorthand NSC 68, which basically said that the alternative to communist power over the entire world was to resist it in every way. And when North Korea invaded the South at the end of June 1950. Truman was persuaded that it was important to resist this, and also there was a commitment to the United Nations to protect the integrity of a country being invaded. The invasion was local. It was sort of, many people you could call it a civil war between North and South. But what happened was, the war then, very quickly, the North, it was a blitzkrieg. The North basically was in control of almost 90% of South Korea, and it became a bigger war very quickly. But then it could have turned around in September. I think it's done in 1950. General MacArthur had his last great military maneuver, which was this invasion, landing at Incheon, which was about 30 miles from Seoul, and that was so successful that the Allied forces, by this time the Americans, and it was basically the Americans and what was left of the South Korean army, had basically pushed the North out. They occupied Pyongyang, and the North was on the run then, and that was the point where I think, and many people think, that the war could have ended. The war could have ended in September 1950, and with basically going back to the status quo ante, and it would have been the original boundaries of between North and South. There was this arbitrary line, the 38th parallel, which divided North Korea and South Korea. That didn't happen. After the success of the Incheon landing, MacArthur went ahead and got permission to go ahead to sort of push onward, to push north. And just as the great leader of North Korea had wanted to unify Korea under communist rule, MacArthur wanted to unify Korea under the auspices of the Allies. And I began to sort of see. I realized later that sort of like the analogy is sort of Gulf War I and Gulf War II. The Korean War could have been like Gulf War I. Gulf War I was to push the Iraqis out of Kuwait, which was a great success. That's what George H.W. Bush managed to do. But Gulf War II became a much bigger, nastier, unending war about regime change. The Korean War could have ended after the Incheon landing, or pretty soon. But then it became a much bigger, wider, and nastier war about regime change, which never happened. It became the great tragedy of the Truman administration. Before it was all over, 37,000 Americans had died. Probably 1 million Chinese, hundreds of thousands of Koreans of North and South. And when it was all over, the North had picked up one city, but nothing else had changed, and it was never really over. The war still hasn't ended. There was a ceasefire, but there was never a truce. And you can't blame Truman for that. There'd never been a war like this before. There'd never been a limited war like this before, and but it was the first war of this kind for us. And we had different iterations for us later on, Vietnam, Afghanistan, but Korea was the first time. And I look at it. You look back. The more we look at it, and see it really was a great tragedy. It didn't have to happen.
But so you would give Truman high marks, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you would give Truman high marks for the decision to intervene, but then lower marks for the decision to allow MacArthur to pursue the North Korean army north of the 38th parallel. Yeah,
absolutely. He basically gave up control of the war to his general, and people were afraid of MacArthur. MacArthur was a big guy. Even General Marshall, when he became Secretary of Defense, he was skittish about it. He was one of Eisenhower's top aides said MacArthur was not a person; he was a personage, and people were very much intimidated by him. And even though you have to realize that you think of MacArthur he was not this great general. MacArthur did not spend one single night in Korea during the entire course of the war, from June 1950 until he got fired in April 51. And then
he was stationed over in Japan. He was stationed over in Japan because he was kind of the overlord of Japan after World War II.
Yeah, he was
but you make a great point. I don't think in our lifetime, I'm 54, a little bit younger than you perhaps, but in our lifetime, we've ever had a general so, I want to say deified, but maybe revered or so respected like MacArthur was in World War II and leading up to in the first year or so of the Korean War. Like, we just haven't experienced that. Colin Powell would be the only person that I could think of, but even though he was in Vietnam, he really didn't. He wasn't this demigod that MacArthur was. So, for Truman, who was a captain of artillery in World War I, to tell Douglas MacArthur, 5-star general, this is how you fight the war, was almost ludicrous.
Yeah. Truman didn't like MacArthur even before he fired him. In his diary, he would speak of this sort of. He would say, "I wish we had better, people, not better people." But he was sort of slightly. He was intimidated by him. General Eisenhower. President Eisenhower once remarked to Ann Whitman, his confidential secretary, about MacArthur. He had worked with MacArthur in the Philippines. He'd been under MacArthur. I guess I forget whether he was a major or lieutenant colonel.
He was a major.
And he said to Ann Whitman, "How could such a damn fool become a general?" He was not respected among his peers, and which was not the same thing. But he had a great PR machine, and that's where he got his power, and he had. And he had his fans in Congress. Eisenhower was, to me, the model of a hero president, of a hero general who really could lead a country. This is off the subject, but I realize more and more realize as time goes by how damn lucky we were as a country to have had Eisenhower as president when he was.
Completely agree, and I guess we should note, in fairness to General of the Army MacArthur, he once praised Eisenhower by calling him the best clerk I ever had.
That's very good.
Truman fired Douglas MacArthur in an act that shocked the nation, shocked the country. Would you have fired MacArthur as Truman did?
Oh, sure. MacArthur was told. Truman at that point was trying to sue for peace, was trying to work out a peace agreement with the North. They never, or ceasefire. And he basically gave orders to MacArthur, stop advancing north. And MacArthur said, basically no. And that's what did it for Truman. That was a complete disobedience of the civilian authorities. So yeah, he had no choice. And he met with the Joint Chiefs, and everyone agreed that was it. He had to go. So,
and then MacArthur comes back to the United States, where he hadn't been for, was it a dozen years or 24 years or whatever it had been forever.
Yeah.
And he gives this speech in Congress where he famously said, "Old soldiers never die. They just fade away." Yeah. But Truman got past that. He didn't regret.
Truman had sort of a very good instinct for for politics, and he kind of knew that this wasn't going to last. Yeah, MacArthur's speech at the time was a huge success. People had tears in their eyes. One congressman said it was I used it. It was like hearing God in the flesh. I mean, but if you watch MacArthur's speech today, you see this theatrical elderly man with a comb over, and you see, where did this come from? And then he did fade away. He went on a tour, visiting different places, and then the crowds got smaller and smaller. And then there were hearings about the war, and MacArthur testified. And basically, sometimes you can't really read MacArthur. He said when I saw the amount of death and destruction, I wanted to vomit. I don't know. Since he'd given the orders that caused lots of it, I don't quite know what he meant. But
we talked about, because we were doing some Cold War discussion here on the Leaders and Legends podcast with Jeffrey Frank. So let's give Truman his due. The 1948 election, he runs with Alben Barkley from Kentucky, I think, against Thomas Dewey, who was governor of New York, and Earl Warren, who was governor of California. And in probably the biggest upset until 2016, Truman wins re-election. We've all seen the newspaper photo or the photo of him holding, I think it's the Chicago Tribune, isn't it? Dewey defeats Truman. How did Truman win that race that almost no one thought he could win?
By the way,
and won handily.
Yeah. By the way, the comparison to 2016 doesn't quite hold, because Truman won the popular vote by a huge margin too. It wasn't just the Electoral College. Yeah, I think people admired his. Well, I don't know. First of all, the polls said he couldn't win. I guess obviously the polls weren't all that great. People didn't much like Dewey. Dewey was not a very appealing figure. He was a New Yorker with a mustache and very, very, very slick. Truman was one of the people, and he was a fighter. And I think people admired that too. And also Truman was a great campaigner. He loved campaigning. He connected on TV and radio. He was terrible, but out with the crowds, he connected with voters. He would also talk about the Do Nothing Congress, which was completely unfair. It was a Do a Lot Congress. It turned out that was the Congress that passed the Marshall Plan. He had passed the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, but Truman was very effective at using that sort of rhetoric. So because
the Republicans did very well in 46 in the congressional elections,
yeah,
which is part of the reason why they thought Truman was going to get thumped.
More than I mean, the Republicans took both houses of Congress for the first time since 1928. It was such a loss that actually there was less sort of partisanship in those days, because one of the Democratic senator from Arkansas, J. William Fulbright, suggested that Truman should resign, and that he should appoint a Republican as Secretary of State, and then resign, and then Republican that could then become president. And they would save all this bother of campaigns and elections and conventions and so on. And Truman never forgot that. He later referred to Fulbright as a jackass, but Fulbright
stayed a thorn in the side of Democrat presidents all through the 60s, if I recall.
That's right.
But he did win. Truman did win, and he did win through vigorous campaigning. And I've always thought that of all the 20th century presidents, that Truman deserves to be on the Mount Rushmore of when it comes to just being politically savvy.
Yeah, and I think he genuinely believed that the whole point of being a president is to try to do make life better for people. And I think he tried to do that. He wasn't a huge New Dealer, but he made incremental improvements in Social Security and so on. But the thing he really tried to do was to try to get a national health insurance policy through. He tried 3 times and failed 3 times, but that was he really thought that was something he could do, and it would be a great thing for his countrymen. So that was that. The idea that being president, the point of it was to try to help your fellow Americans. Was real, and I think people sensed that.
So let's talk a little bit about 3 things that happened. I think during his first term, or we kind of skipped through them to get to Korea, and that is the Berlin airlift, the creation of NATO, and the passing and implementation of the Marshall Plan.
Yeah.
3 enormous events. One, 2 of them, one of them an alliance. The other one, the last one I mentioned, the Marshall Plan, is more of a program. But how the Americans handled the Berlin airlift to me is it's just a morsel of brilliancy. I've read the book The Candy Bombers, which is what the planes were nicknamed. Talk to us maybe, if you want to, in order of those three things, how Truman was involved and why you would give, as I think he deserves, why you would give President Truman, high marks for all three.
Oh, absolutely. He didn't actually have that much to do with the Marshall Plan himself, but his advisors did. The same with the Berlin airlift. But the Berlin airlift was a brilliant response to what was happening. The Russians were aggressively blocking access to Berlin, which as you know was like this little island in the middle of East Germany, which was under Soviet control. And so, was there going to be a war? Well, no. I mean, a war would have been hopeless. Admiral Leahy knew that there was no way we could fight and win a war there. And when the blockade went up, what do we do? Well, there was actually one entrance into Berlin still, and that was by air. And they came up with the idea that we could fly enough supplies of heating oil and food and so on to keep the Berliners warm and fed. It lasted, and it was a huge success. And finally, and meanwhile, there was a counter blockade, which was also hurting Russia, and that finally wound down. NATO, which came in actually the second term, was another huge success. Truman, it was this alliance of countries, these Northern countries. There were, and Truman said, let's try to compare it to a neighborhood watch group. And which was
he's always the local politician,
always the local politician, but understood but also that was a good way to explain it to his countrymen. We're like a bunch of neighbors trying to help each other. And so England, France, the Scandinavian countries, we could all, and that's what they did, and it was a very effective alliance. It changed greatly. I don't know. I always wonder what Truman would have thought about the NATO expansion, which George Kennan thought was maybe the great tragedy of the post-Cold War era, to expand NATO as it was. But the Marshall Plan was the really amazing thing. I think when you ask this, I asked this question. This question had never been asked. What would a country that had unlimited strength, unlimited military power, and unlimited wealth, how would they handle it? And the Marshall Plan was the answer to that. This act of extraordinary generosity, also self-interest, but generosity, to sort of build, rebuild the rubble of Europe, and also the defeated nations of Europe, Germany, and then later on Japan. And it was extraordinary policy and extraordinarily successful. And we're still feeling the success of it today. And that's something that Truman, I think, will be more than anything. I mean, NATO in one way, but also the Marshall Plan in a big way. And the Berlin airlift was a sign of what we could do with short of war to defend our interests.
We have a few more minutes with author Jeffrey Frank. You discuss, and then it was in this other book that I read earlier in the year, Truman's achievements, Truman's attitude towards civil rights, post-World War II civil rights. If you read about some of the things that the treatment of returning African-American soldiers from World War II, it just makes your stomach turn. There's famous individual cases where people were beaten or murdered down in the South. You mentioned a few minutes ago, as we started the podcast, that Truman is basically the descendant of Confederates out there in Missouri. And he had a lot of friends in the Senate. The Democrats were disproportionately representing the South and had that Southern racist, there's no other word for it, bigoted attitude. And he was friends with them. How do you grade Harry Truman's efforts and achievements on civil rights, to include the report to secure these rights, which I think is a fascinating document?
It is. I mean, he really was someone who transcended his own background. He did not particularly like African Americans. He actually gave a speech which said they do not want social equality, and basically making clear, well, we don't want it either. But they want justice, and he came to believe in that. I think what happened, that yes, you mentioned these horrendous of things happening in the South. There was one particular case where a returning GI named Isaac Woodard was intentionally blinded by a local lawman who basically put his billy club right through his eyeballs and potentially blinded him. And that became a huge case, actually so much so that Orson Welles, who by that time had a regular 15-minute broadcast, talked about it, read the affidavit that Isaac Woodard filed. Truman was deeply affected by this, and he actually spoke at the Lincoln Memorial. Along with these hated enemies in Missouri, of like people like Eleanor Roosevelt and Justice Black and the head of the NAACP, and he said basically, the African Americans, our Negro citizens, deserve every opportunity to succeed, to prosper in this country, just as the rest of us. He once said something, and I've used this before, that he said there are two people sit at this desk: the President of the United States and Harry Truman. And when he was speaking about civil rights, it was the President of the United States. It wasn't Harry Truman, who still had these. He still privately he used the N-word. He was still by modern standards a racist. But the President of the United States was going to do what he could for all Americans, and so I would give him high grades. And the civil rights bill that he proposed was sort of modest by modern standards, but it was enough to alienate the South. Basically, the South has stayed alienated. They walked out of the 48 convention, and that's when the Dixiecrat Party, the so-called Dixiecrat Party, was formed, and it was the third party in the 48 election.
This makes President Truman's triumph in the 48 election even more astonishing. I think it's one of the most incredible political achievements, Truman's election in 48 in his own right. One of the most astonishing political achievements in American history, that he could survive not only the Republicans, who had just done very well in the 46 midterms, but the fact that the Dixiecrats under Strom Thurmond siphoned away several electoral votes, and he had Henry Wallace and the Progressives who were siphoning away some Democrat votes. It's just a remarkable achievement. Speaking of domestic achievements, where would Truman famously left office in 52 with an approval rating at 26 or 31 or something? It was absolutely abysmal.
Fluctuated, definitely in the low 30s at best. Yeah.
So how would you grade him as civil rights aside, just domestically, with everything he had to worry about in terms of the international situation? Do you believe he was a successful president in terms of domestic policy?
I do. I mean, I think we begin to realize that as time goes by. I mean, I don't know how I'd rank him. I mean, these rankings are, great. He certainly was not the great presidents. I think we can all agree that Lincoln and Washington were our great presidents, and possibly Franklin Roosevelt was the third one. That was kind of it. But Truman was up there. Truman, I think you have to judge Truman on not how he was viewed in his time, which was not terribly favorably, but what he accomplished. And Henry Steele Commager did a piece for Look magazine late in his second term, saying, for all these, we didn't mention all the sort of pathetic little scandals that followed him too. They were as he was leaving office, or the fact that he tried to seize the steel industry and was shot down by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, by the way, that was consisted entirely of justices appointed by Truman and Franklin Roosevelt. Said no. That was, but for all that, it was what he accomplished. He left the world safer for time, and he made the country, and he did things for his countrymen, and by those standards, he was a successful president, and that's why we like him. And he was always, by the way, he was an honorable man, for all of his flaws, for all of his vanities, and so on. And he was a man, he deeply loved the Constitution, and being an American, he was a patriot in the best sense of the word. He loved this country's good history, and it meant a lot to him, and he loved being part of it.
And would you say, how much credit would you give to David McCullough in his biography, Truman, in the revitalization and sort of revisionist look at Truman's presidency?
I think it was very important. David McCullough's book really, became a bestseller. People began to say, "Oh well, Truman." I mean, people were already. A lot of historians were sort of viewing Truman much more favorably, but David McCullough made it much more real, much more human. David McCullough was an extraordinary, sort of detailed, granular, cradle to grave biography. I mean, you mentioned that I did a I did a preface sort of covering Truman up until the presidency. McCullough went back through generations of Trumans who really saw where he came from. So it was an extraordinary achievement with McCullough's. But it was obviously he had a different goal. Mine was basically the biography of a presidency. McCullough was the biography of a person, a man.
You mentioned his name a few minutes ago, and that in some ways, Dwight Eisenhower, 5-star general, was Harry Truman's beau ideal of a general, along with George Marshall. And if we're talking about leaders, we should mention William Leahy, who was actually the highest ranking military man in World War II. Most people don't realize that, but he received 5-star rank before anyone else, one day before Marshall. But famously, President Truman and General Eisenhower had a massive falling out as we got into the 1952 campaign, which eventually was won by Eisenhower. Talk to us a little bit about how they fell out, and do you believe that Truman offered to step aside so that Eisenhower could be president in 48 or 52? Because Truman could have run for another term in 52 because the 22nd Amendment didn't apply to him.
I believe the 48 story. I believe that when he saw Roosevelt, when he saw Eisenhower in Germany before Potsdam, and he turned to him and said, "General, I can give you anything you want, including the presidency." I think he meant it. I don't know whether he would have, if Ike had said, which I think Truman knew that Eisenhower would never have said, "Sure, give me the presidency." I'm sure Truman knew that would never happen, but it was a way to tell Eisenhower that he admired him, and he did admire him greatly. And so in 52, there was never an offer of the presidency to Eisenhower, but Eisenhower was being promoted by people, including Franklin Roosevelt's children, to be nominated. But Truman was not going to run again in 52. He was worn out. His wife was worn out. And when he announced in April of 52 that he wasn't going to run again, it was basically not much of a secret anymore. The falling out with Eisenhower was sort of a sad story. I mean, they really did. Eisenhower really kind of liked Truman. Truman really admired Eisenhower, but when the Democratic nominee Adlai Stevenson was running against Eisenhower, and Truman, always the partisan guy, jumped into it. And I think what cut it for Truman was when Eisenhower didn't defend George Marshall, who had been Eisenhower's mentor and his helper. Who helped Eisenhower's career. And Eisenhower genuinely admired Marshall, but there was a moment in the campaign when Marshall was being trashed by Senator McCarthy and by Senator Jennings, and basically being accused of being a crypto communist. And Eisenhower had defended MacArthur. Had defended Marshall in a speech, and the speech had actually been printed in the New York Times as an advanced text, and then. So everyone knew he was going to say this, but when he came to it, he was speaking in Wisconsin, the home state of Senator McCarthy. Eisenhower took it out of the speech, and it never ran. Truman thought that was gutless, and it was. It was Eisenhower's. It was really a spineless moment. Eisenhower. I'm a great admirer of Eisenhower, but it was not a great moment. Eisenhower. It was basically welcome to politics, Ike. And he didn't do the right. He didn't do the right thing.
Do you?
I'm going to forgave Truman for that. They spoke. They became courteous later on, though not during the inauguration. And but they never really. I never really forgave him. I don't think.
They bonded a little bit when they saw each other at the funeral of John F. Kennedy.
Yeah,
and that kind of thawed it a little bit, but they never became close again, if I remember.
No, they're right. They had coffee together, and Eisenhower visited the Truman Library to sort of see how do you do this. But there was never any closeness between them after the 52 campaign.
Let me ask you one final question before we move on to the 5 questions that we ask all of our guests here on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Do you have a favorite Truman story? There's so many.
No. I sort of like the familiar ones. I sort of love his attack on the music critic of the Washington Post after he gave a bad review to his daughter. This is a famous story, but there's more to it than that. He wrote this letter he was in a terrible state. He had the Korean War was going on, and his press secretary, Charlie Ross, who had been a friend since childhood, had just suddenly died at his desk. But Truman was in an emotional mess. And then his daughter Margaret gave a recital at Constitution Hall, and by God, she got a bad review from the Washington Post critic, and it was really a nasty review. And Truman was so ticked off that he wrote a letter to Hume saying, if I ever run into you, you may need a new beefsteak for your eye, maybe a supporter below. And this letter, I mentioned Charlie Ross. Letter would never have gone out had Ross lived. There would have been an outbox. He would have seen it. What is this? But Truman left the White House and put it in a mailbox. And that's how it was delivered. So I sort of love that story. This was Truman being free and unrestrained.
My favorite Truman story, you mentioned it, you alluded to it, is that when the date of Dwight Eisenhower's inauguration as president, Dwight Eisenhower noticed his son, John, who had been deployed to Korea. His son, John, was in the audience, and Eisenhower was convinced that it was done to embarrass him.
Yeah.
And personally, and Eisenhower looked at Truman and goes, "Who ordered my son here?" And Eisenhower had a very famous temper, very curtly looked at Truman and said, "Who ordered my son here?" And Truman's response, which is just absolutely perfect, he looked at Eisenhower and said, "The President of the United States did." I just love that. It's so Truman.
I know. Eisenhower later on Eisenhower was not ungrateful for this. I mean, he appreciated the gesture, but at the moment, it's true. The Eisenhower temper really came out there.
Truman's like, "I'm the president of the United States," and I did. And for the next 10 minutes, I'm the president and I'm in charge. Terrific. Brilliant. That's
very much in line with what we talked about before. There are two people at this desk, and it wasn't Harry Truman. It was the president who did this. Yeah, exactly.
It's time for the 5 questions with journalist, author, and incredibly gracious guest, Jeffrey Frank. Mr. Frank, are you ready? These are harmless, I promise.
Mr. Bain, I don't know if I'm going to do here. I'm a little worried.
Oh, these are all you'll get an A no matter what your answers are. We're easy graders here. Number 1, what was your first job?
I guess I had the first newspaper job at the Ithaca New York Journal, which was great fun. My wife was going to Cornell, and we happened to move up there.
Oh, what was your first concert?
My first concert. Well, my sister's became a cellist with the National Symphony, so it was probably some concert by the National Symphony when I was a kid, dragged to by my father. My first rock concert was in Washington. I saw some of the. I used to go to the Howard Theater, and I would see people like Bo Diddley when I was a kid. And so those were my first my kind of concerts.
That works for sure.
Yeah.
Number 3. If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Oh my goodness! I mean, that's. I guess I would recommend a novel. I mean, I would recommend Middlemarch. I mean, something to get us away from this, from this time. I would recommend histories. I would recommend a book, a biography of Theodore Roosevelt. I would recommend. I don't know. I'm just trying to think. There's so many. I'm reading several things right now. One of them is this just kind of sticks me because I'm actually reading 3 or 4 things simultaneously right now. I'm reading Eric Larson's In the Garden of Beasts, which is kind of wonderful, which I'm reading in conjunction with Mark Leibovich's Thank You for Your Servitude, which is also kind of wonderful. And they're two sort of stories of enabling of enabling.
Eric Larson's books get mentioned quite a bit when I ask this question of other guests. I'm currently reading.
I'm late coming to that, so I'm reading it right now for the first time.
I'm reading Harold Holzer's book on the press and presidents, which is terrific. Terrific. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And he's come on the podcast twice. He was an amazing guest. Yeah. Thank you, Ruthie. Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
I suppose the Gettysburg Address. I mean, I would have been such a great moment to have been there to that horrible war, and then to have heard Lincoln deliver that amazing address. I like to think that I would have heard it and reacted and realized that it was something special.
Unlike the Chicago newspaper that said the dishwatery utterances of the man who has to be pointed out to intelligent foreigners as the president of the United States, perhaps the worst speech review in the history of the United States. Yeah. Last question, and this will be interesting because I know you've had dinner with a lot of amazing people, but if you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record to talk about anything you want, whom would you choose?
I mean, that is really unfair because I can't think of any politician I would want to have dinner with today.
Well, Barack Obama and George W. Bush are the two most popular answers, just to give you
I'd
hint.
rather. I feel like there's nothing I wouldn't have heard before from either one of them. Okay, but I'm sure that Barack Obama would have some great gossip to spread. I would enjoy. I'd like to sit down with Mitch McConnell if he would open up to me. He's
Mitch McConnell. That's a good answer.
If he would open up, I don't know, but I hear that he doesn't open up. But if I could, but I would love to have dinner with Richard Nixon, but he's not around anymore. I met him once. And,
what about Monica Crowley? She wrote those really good books, or
I'm actually in Monica's book.
And what about Pat Buchanan? He's wrote two terrific books on Nixon, The Greatest Comeback and Nixon's White House Wars. I mean, they were something else. You must know Monica's Pat Buchanan.
Book, I'm actually in Monica Crowley's book by name.
For?
I had tried to get, this is when I was at the Washington Post and I was in the Outlook section, and this was toward the end of first George Bush's term, and I thought, let's get Richard Nixon to write about the relations with the Soviet Union. This is when Yeltsin had taken over, and so I said, Nixon will never write for the Washington Post. Well, so let me give it a try. So I called his house, and there was Monica Crowley who answered the phone, and she said, I'll see if he'll do it. And so he sent a piece in, which I thought was pretty good. I edited it pretty hard, sent it back. I got it back the next morning, much better version than I did. Nixon had re-edited it and made it much better than I had made it. And we ran it. It was great. Apparently, the piece actually had some effect on our policy vis-a-vis Russia. And I became friends with Monica. We actually ran Monica's excerpt at the New Yorker. We ran an excerpt from Monica's book about
I'd love
Nixon.
To have her on the podcast to talk about Nixon. Would absolutely love to. I need to take a flyer and reach out to her.
She's great. I do not understand her feelings about the last president, but we're still very good friends, and we just don't talk about that.
I think that's
I would say something like, "What would Nixon
attitude?"
do?
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest has been Jeffrey Frank, who is the author of The Trials of Harry S. Truman, The Extraordinary Presidency of an Ordinary Man, 1945 to 1953. Please buy this book if you want to burnish your history of certainly the early years of the Cold War. I can think of no other better book to read. It's been an absolute honor to speak with you, Mr. Frank, and I thank you in advance for coming back soon to talk about your book, Ike and Dick. Thank you so much for your time. I very much enjoy your writings.
Mr. Vane, it was an absolute pleasure to be here. I really had fun being with you, except for the last question. I said I couldn't think who I want to have dinner with. I'm sure we can have dinner sometime if you were ever in the East Coast. I'd like that very much.
I was in Manhattan about 4 or 5 months ago. And so if I'd known, I'd have looked you up. But if I go back, you can count on it. It's very, very kind of you to say that. And thank you for your time. And I look forward to the next interview.
I do too. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.
This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Spangle and Leaders and Legends LLC. If you're interested in starting a podcast or taking yours to the next level, please contact us at leadersandlegends.net.